night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the program, everyone. Since we changed software here, things are just so much more complicated than they ever have been. And we're trying to just wade through this. I mean, it's kind of cool. You've seen some of the graphics that we now have access to. The only other thing I want to remind you of before we go to break and get our guest in here is that we've got a great YouTube audience and a YouTube community. And if you're listening to this show as a podcast, thank you very much for doing that, by the way. We do appreciate our podcast base. It's a large group of people that download the show every day, and thank you very much for doing that. But you should also swing by the YouTube channel and check out what we've got going on YouTube, because that's where we stream live. That's where our chat room is, and there's a lot going on there, plus about 500 back episodes. Go to YouTube, search for JV Johnson, and you will find the channel. Please subscribe. Our numbers are growing there, and we'd love to see those ticking up every day. So thank you so much if you've already subscribed, and if you haven't done that yet, we appreciate you doing that. So we are going to go to our guest line and bring in our good friend Scotty Roberts, because I know Scotty always has something to talk about. Scotty, my friend, how are you in this last minute switcheroo here? How you doing?
JV, I am doing great. Thank you for the minute notice. I that gives me some time to get warmed up.
Do you really need any more than that, frankly?
Rarely ever, I tell you.
So, we didn't, obviously this wasn't planned, but I can think of no better person to grab in a pinch here than you, because I know you're always working on something interesting. So if I throw it out, what are you working on these days?
Well, let's see. I've got a ton of things stacked up that I'm working on, but I can say this. I've been going through a series on my own radio show about now, I don't know where you stand on this, and some people get a little nervous about this stuff when you start introducing the topic, but I was looking into Christo-paganism, and I was asking the question, is there compatibility between Christianity and paganism? Not because I'm a pagan, but because I used to be very Christian. And, I was a Baptist fundamentalist, conservative, and I went to seminary, and I was in youth ministry for a long time. And so I was very dyed-in-the-wool. And I started, along with all the other questions I had about things, I started looking into this whole question about why is there such a great divide between religions that are out there and spirituality. So I started digging into it. And it's not a study of how to be a better Christian or a better pagan or to do something. It was a study that I started asking people, why do you believe what you say you believe? And I say, if you're going to believe something and put your heart in it, do you know what you believe? And I started digging into paganism, digging into Christianity, giving overviews, looking at history, and finding, and I'll tell you, this is the thing that threw me. As I was doing my own research, it seemed to me that and now, I don't want to offend anybody's sensibilities in your audience. I'm not telling anybody what to believe or how to believe. You choose your own spirituality and your own faith structure. But what I found historically, it's like if I'm going to put my faith in something, I need to know what it means. I need to know what it's about. And what I kept finding over and over again, every source I went, it seemed that Christianity that we know today was not the Christianity that existed for the first 300 to 400 years after the time of Christ. And most of it started off with the Gnostic mysteries and the mystery religions, and then it morphed its way eventually into how the Orthodox believers started taking over. They kind of won the fight there. And they started turning what was to be originally a mythological look at the Messiah character. And by mythology, I don't mean fake. I mean the mythology, the mysteries, and all of these things. Mm-hmm. And they started literalizing history. And when they did that, they completely changed the whole face of what it originally was. And then the Orthodox Church, which didn't become the Roman Church, Roman Catholic, until after Constantine in the mid-300s, early 300s, really took over and made Christianity the state religion, and it became illegal to not be a Christian in Rome. And during the interim years in there, the a little over 3 centuries in there, they had been trying to, as the Orthodox Church took hold and started making things more literal, they started committing persecutions against the pagan religions and the pagan Christians, the Gnostic mystery Christians. And we didn't know anything about this stuff down through history except for scant writings of them until in the 1940s at Nag Hammadi, they discovered, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, this whole cache of old Gnostic religious writings that dated back to the time of Christ, before and after. And so it became, this is the stuff I've been working on lately. And I got to tell you, sometimes you say, wait a minute, I'm challenging the things I say I used to believe. And thereby past tense, you can see there are some things I've had to just step away from.
Right.
Because I say, if I cannot provide factual evidence that this existed and worked, then how can I put faith into it? Faith is supposed to be, yes, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, I'm not an atheist by any means. I'm an agnostic, meaning Gnostic, gnosis, knowledge. Knowledge is what it is. I have no real knowledge of what is true anymore with this stuff, other than the historical record says this. And how can you controvert the historical record with just simply faith? That doesn't cut it. And so these are the things I've been digging into, and I could go as deep as you wanted me to go on that tonight, or we could move on to another topic.
Well, you've piqued my curiosity here, because having no time to prepare for this particular topic, you're throwing words at me that I'm not even sure I understand the definition of or the meaning of. So
sure.
I want to back this up a little bit, because I'm very curious about it. So if there were pagan Christians, or I can't even remember all of the titles that you used, and we found writings rather recently that describe these beliefs and these ideas. How do they differ? What is the fulcrum here of difference between what we know as Christianity and what these other versions of Christianity are?
Well, in Gnosticism, there was the mysteries, they called it. They would draw people into the inner mysteries, the esoteric, if you will. And but what they had on the outside, it was kind of a system that would draw people in and create an interest on the outer levels. They called it exoteric mysteries. And people would ask questions and so on. And once they found that somebody was very interested, they would draw them in and ask if they wanted to be initiated into the deeper mysteries. Now, some of the things that were involved in this, think of it this way. And you know this, and all of us know this to some extent. When you look at, like, December 25th as being the date of Jesus' birthday.
Right.
And now we all know, really, if you put any thought into it at all, that's probably not the date he was born.
Right.
As a matter of fact, you look at the story in the Gospels, and you end up with where the shepherds were, close to the city, close to Bethlehem, and all these other things seem to indicate that it was around Passover time, which was April. But we don't know that for sure. Anyway, you start looking at that, and then you look at take out and bullet point all kinds of things about the life of Jesus as listed in the Bible. Born on December 25th, virgin birth, shepherds attending his birth, magi attending, a star in the sky. Then you go to his later life, walking on the water, healing the sick, raising the dead, then death, burial, and resurrection by crucifixion. Now, if I were to list all those bullet points to you, without saying who I was talking about, you could come up with and go, oh, well, obviously, Scotty, that's Jesus. And I would say yes, but did you know that also almost all of those different bullet points match up with at least 12 previous God-men types that were Messiah types that came under the names of Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, all of these different gods, and they were God-men. And all those in the ancient mysteries knew them to be, there was something you had to pull out. There was the deeper mysteries. It was a mystery, it was a mythology that they knew that applied to all of these different God-men. Then Jesus comes along, and again, some people are going to be really rankled by this, but that's the purpose. You got to shake the foundation a little bit sometime to see where you stand. And Jesus comes along, and what does his followers do? His followers start ascribing to him all the same bullet points that you see in these other God-men in the Gnostic mysteries, because the mysteries were a religion that was spread all through the Middle East and all up into Turkey and all up into the Mediterranean world. And the Jews themselves had done it. They had created the Jewish mysteries. And then now the Christians came along, and they needed to do the same thing with Jesus. They needed to apply all these things to him because the original believers were part of the Gnostic mysticism. And so they applied all these things to him. And it wasn't until the Orthodox believers started to use this as literalist history of Jesus. And so when you start putting, and I'm just giving it to you in ultra light here, but when you start looking at this stuff, the first thing I did, I sit back in my chair when I'm studying this stuff, and I go, it's the WTF moment about spirituality and religion. It's like, okay, if this is so historically with Gnosticism, with mystery religions and all of this, then how did they arrive at Jesus being divine, Jesus being God, all these different things about Jesus? Why do all these things apply to him that also applied to at least 12 other guys centuries before he was born? And you know what one of the explanations was?
What?
In the late second century, Justin Martyr, he was a church apologist, and what he called all those previous God types, now he's within the Orthodox Church, which eventually became the Roman Catholic Church. And he said, you cannot believe that this is so, because here is what really happened. This was his explanation for it. He said, all of those previous gods that look like the same thing as Jesus and have all these bullet points that match, he said, they are what we call diabolical mimicry. It was Satan who raised them all up in order to confound the hearts and minds of men so that when the real God-man came, they would be confused. And my answer to that was always, well, if God is who God says God is, omnipresent, omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing, the creator, the one who controls everything off the tips of his fingers, he sees this happening with these God-men. Why couldn't he just say, you know what? Diabolical mimicry. Satan's up to it again. I think I'll just reshuffle the deck and we'll do this a little different way so he doesn't confound my plan. But that's not what happened. And that's kind of a cynical take on that. But you start looking at
getting
this.
Crotchety. You're getting a little crotchety here.
That's a good way to put it.
No, go ahead.
So, I was just going to go on with that and in the same vein and say that's the stuff I'm thinking about these days.
And we're going to continue this conversation on the other side of the break. But one of the things that I'm curious about is because we seem to keep getting more and more physical evidence, whether it's archaeological evidence or in some ways it's quantum evidence or other scientific evidence that some of the things, not everything, but some of the things that we've questioned about the Bible for a very, very long time, we're starting to see some things that support these ideas very directly. Does that change any of this for you? Or, how does that fit into this whole idea?
How we're finding things that challenge the nomenclature or the
I'm saying we're finding things that are supporting what the Bible is telling us, the accounts that are in the Bible. We're finding things that support those accounts.
To me,
yeah,
I understand that 100%, and I agree with you, because while you see that there are things that involve faith issues that we're finding out more history and more things that seem to make you want to think and dig a little deeper, you can find historical things in the Bible that they've had, at least as of, I don't know when the date was, but I read in one of these journals a while back, at least 1,500 different points of history in the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament that had been verified by archaeology. Now, I have said all the way along, the Bible contains efficacious history. It's real history. You're finding that most of these writers of history didn't twist and dick with the history too much. But what you'll find is that that's a totally different story than the faith story they wrap around it. And so they place their own faith stories on the historical events. Say, something as simple as, well, maybe it's not simple, but look at the Exodus. If that is an historical event, the history of that event is one thing, but did God use miracles? Was God involved?
Right.
All of those kinds of questions start coming up.
Scotty, do you know anything about Nostradamus?
Not very much. I've got a book of all his quatrains, and I've read some of them, and I go, bah. It's like reading Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Which I love Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But I'd have to sit down and study it, and I never have. I've heard lots of things back and forth, and boy, that's just too close to be a coincidence.
Yeah.
Well, I don't believe in coincidences, and I do believe that there are people who are prophetic. I think maybe he was onto something in some things.
Let's pick up that conversation in our next hour. Right now, let's go to the phone lines, though. This is Joe in Buffalo, New York. Hey, Joe, welcome to the show.
I'm glad you called, or allowed my call to come in.
I'm glad you called, Joe.
It.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe.
Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Okay, we're discussing the validity, I guess you could say, about the Bible and the things that go on in the Bible.
Yep.
And whether to believe them. Well, I've been brought up in a religious home all my life, and I listened. And a lot of times I had to, I guess, so to speak. My parents would be talking and saying, "You're going to church whether you like it or not." So I'd go. And after a while, I liked it. And I paid attention. I said, "Hey, it makes sense." So all through my life, I just paid attention to what was going on in the world, current events. And when I noticed that the Bible, its predictions, you would see it in current day events. And things that were prophesied over 2,000 years ago, you're seeing it coming out in current events. And that's what kind of convinced me to think, hey, wait a second, this isn't just a story. What I'm reading here, like when 1947, when the Jews returned to their Holy Land, that was one of the signs prophesied over 2,000 years ago, that before the second coming of Jesus Christ, that the Jews would return to their homeland, which they did in 1947. And I said, do you call that a coincidence?
Right. What are your thoughts, Scott?
There's a couple of things about that that I looked into, and I was very much in the conservative Baptist fundamentalist setting. I wasn't raised there, by the way. I joined it by choice. I became a born-again Christian when I was 11. And much to my agnostic family's chagrin, I became like the Alex Keaton of my family. The white shirt with tie-wearing conservative who went to church all the time. My mom told me when I was a teenager, she said, "I wish you would just swear once in a while so I would know you were normal." And this is the way I let myself be inculcated into belief system. And eschatology was one of the big things, the study of end times. Now, there's something very interesting about this that you've got to use as a backup. Remember, you were talking, when you look at like the writings of Paul in the New Testament, he talks about how the end times are coming. The second coming is on us. And all of this is imminent. It's returning. That's because in their day, they actually believed that the second coming of Jesus was going to be in their lifetimes. And they were a bit chagrined by the beginning of the second century that this hadn't happened yet. And one thing you'll find there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, what's interesting is that there were about 70 to 75 Gospels that exist. And a lot of them were uncovered in the findings at Nag Hammadi in the mid-40s. And these other Gospels, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mattathias, the Gospel of James, the brother of Jesus, the Gospel of so on and so on and so on. The Gospel of Mary even existed, Mary Magdalene. And all of these things were things that during the Council of Nicaea, where it started, in the following councils, after the 300s under Constantine, and then further emperors and councils took this all up throughout the next century, was determining what was God-breathed Scripture. And they ended up tossing out all but these 4 Gospels. Now, what's interesting is that 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, are almost, not word for word, but in all of their content, are precisely what Mark was teaching, this Marconian gospel. And they're finding that there was an original Gospel of Mark that dated into the late 1st century, upon which Luke and Matthew were based. And you start seeing that what the church did was they gathered together scriptures that laid out a literal history gospel as opposed to the other gospels. And you find this throughout the New Testament, too. There's about 6, 7 books in the New Testament that are obvious. You can call them forgeries. You can call them edits or rewrites. And people say, well, how do you know that? Well, it's because of the first thing you can go to is language. The linguistics used in these books were not in use in the 1st century. Sometimes not even the 2nd century. It was the 3rd century. It's like, pick up, Tolkien's work, or Lord of the Rings, and read how that's written, or Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars. You read those books, and the English used there is very different. And those books were only written, a little less than a century ago. Tolkien even sooner. And we used a different form of English. And so a story being written now would have different English usage. Now, that's exactly what happened in some of these old biblical books, is they found that the cases for forgery or cases for I'm writing under the name of, the disciple Thomas, and yet it doesn't use language that was used in the day that Thomas would have lived in the 1st century. It uses language that's more indicative of the 3rd and 4th century. That's by way of example. And so this was one of the first things that keyed in, not usually the average, the common reader. It would tune in these people who are scholars in this area, historians, linguistics, and they say, wait a minute, the language doesn't even work here. So when does this really date to? And they'd have to date these things back as far as they could. And I used to be an apologist for the New Testament and the Old Testament being absolutely accurate until I started to find more and more, when people say contradictions, it's sometimes an excuse, but you would find those contradictions. And when it came to the end times, which you're talking about, things that might look like they apply to today. And you know what? Maybe they do. Maybe this is all washed up, and maybe it's true. But all these gospel writers, all of these New Testament writers, Paul himself, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, believed they were in the end times already. And they were applying all those things to things going on in Rome, to things going on all around them. And of course, John, writing probably the latest original book, the book of Revelation, in almost, 60 to 70 years after the time of Christ. So he was in his dotage as an old man on the Isle of Patmos under house arrest, and he had these visions and wrote about them. But there are also things about the book of Revelation that really proves that the book itself was written much later than that time. The language in it is much later. So it's almost like saying, I can look at these books and scientifically or mathematically or by virtue of certain facts be able to look at these things and say, it doesn't mesh with the story we've been told overall, because It's not the language of the day even to begin with. And then there's so many other things that tie into it. And so when I look at the doctrine of the end times, the teaching of eschatology, I find that all of those things were things that they explicitly expressed were going to happen within that first, generation after the time of Jesus. And it didn't. And so then what happened later in the church is the Orthodox Church. It didn't become the Roman Catholic Church till the late 300s, or the mid-300s, after Constantine made it the state religion. But that's when you really started seeing the church fathers starting to go in and make changes to things. It's like, here's a little for instance, Mary Magdalene. We've all heard seen the movie or read the book, the Da Vinci Code, where it says, well, Jesus, they think, may have been married to Mary Magdalene. And the woman that, according to the scripture, Jesus cast out demons, it cleansed her, that she was plagued by demons and was sick and ill. Now, what did the church make her? The church turned her into a prostitute. But never in any single scripture do you find that she is referenced as a prostitute. But this is something the church created because they did not want to have the teachings of Mary upheld. Because after the time of Jesus' death, there are a couple of the Gnostic Gospels, the apocryphal Gospels, which talk about Mary being the woman that Jesus appointed to be the great teacher in his leave. Once he was gone, she would take over. Book of Mattathias calls her the great teacher. And so you look at these stories of her, but it didn't jive with what the Orthodox Church wanted to accept as literalist history, and it also did not jive with what they wanted to put forward in the church, and that was that a woman shouldn't teach in the church. A woman should keep her head covered. A woman should go home and ask her husband if she has questions. There couldn't possibly be a woman who could teach in the church. And also, they wanted to, they had this doctrine of celibacy. And how could a woman be married to Jesus at some point? And you look at all of this, and you start piecing it together bit by bit by bit, to say there are great changes that took place in the early doctrines, not because it was a thing of faith, but because it was a thing of hierarchy and power. And so what the church set up, the Orthodox Church, which won the argument, obviously, they started establishing their hierarchy. That was the goal, establish the hierarchy, and the common people don't know anything. And then, and then you have... all along through that time, not only did they change all these doctrines, the doctrines about the end times, the doctrines about all of this, the thing I just talked about Mary, they also did away with things like in the Gospel of Philip, where it talks about how Jesus walked hand in hand with Mary the Magdalene along with his disciples, and he leaned over and kissed her on the... And then there's a rip in the document, and it picks up in the next sentence. Oh, what did he kiss her on? Did he kiss her lips? Did he kiss her hand? Did he kiss her on the neck? Was it a formal greeting, a customary thing? Or because he was walking with her hand in hand with his disciples, and his disciples were a little jealous of her that she was so close to Jesus. We're your guys. It's kind of like, when your guys in college were all frat boys, and one of the guys gets a girlfriend, and all of a sudden he disappears. That's maybe a little trite, but as a way of example. But guys are like, hey, we're the boys, and they're seeing this go on. And Jesus said, I love Mary in a different way than I love you. And so there's a little room for speculation there. But this is the kind of thing that you saw taking place when the hierarchy of the Orthodox literalist Church, which became the Roman Catholic Church, this is what they did to gain power over the thoughts and the minds of the people.
Joe, did that answer get to the point of your question?
Yeah, pretty much.
Good.
Covered it. The only point I wanted to make is that there were other angles that approach it, and the one I'd like to mention is that I studied psychology, okay? got a couple of degrees in it. And I saw things that they were trying to accomplish in the psychiatric field that they couldn't do. In other words, they would use medication of all kinds they have today, tranquilizers, okay? And I used to watch patients getting shot up with all kinds of things. I saw shock therapy, and I'm wondering, wait a second, this person's got some problems, and they can't touch it with medication. So when you start talking about the soul, so there's something, I always believed there was something deeper inside. And I thought, I started thinking, I said, I looked upon Jesus in one perspective as being a psychologist, okay? Even looking at him as a psychologist, that he's the world's best psychologist or psychiatrist there ever was, because he knew how to lift guilt off the shoulders of people when he'd say pray.
Indeed.
And he said, lift. Because most people that I saw that came into psychiatric institutions were guilt-ridden, okay? They had done something and were told, you're no good, you're going to hell, and nobody stuck, if you go to a psychiatric hospital and you tell the doctor, well, yeah, I talk to God, talk to him all the time. Well, the first thing they're going to say is he hallucinates. Obviously, he needs more tranquilizers. And I just think that that's an important area that man should study more. That he does have a soul.
What I think prayer is, and don't anybody go too bananas when I say this out there. Prayer is a form. Did you know that the Roman Church is full of magical ceremonies that they took from the pagan mysteries and incorporated it, just like they would incorporate December 25th, the birthday of Mithras, as the birthday of Jesus. Just like they would take old pagan groves, the Druid groves, and tear them down and build a cathedral. And you see imagery all over the walls of iconography. Just like they did with that, they took the idea of prayer. And prayer, what is prayer? Prayer is exactly what the definition of what are the words I'm looking for? It's where you visualize something, you manifest something. What is magic? Natural magic is the ability within those mystery circles to be able to perform magic out of nature by visualizing, by meditating, by actualizing something. And this is what prayer, we don't think of prayer as being magic, but prayer is exactly what the mystery religions taught in Gnosticism as a way to attain magical, not power, that's not the word I'm looking for, be able to manifest magic in one of these many different ways. And so praying about something, when somebody prays, they are actually performing ancient mystical magic because they are putting out intent. They are putting out visualization. They are putting out actualization and manifestation. And, and what did the Bible tell us? The Bible said, pray without ceasing. Pray always. Always. And what do we say to people when we talk to them about manifesting something in their lives? You can't just burn a candle and manifest something. You have to visualize it. You have to have
you have to have faith. I mean, I think that's a large part of it. They speak
what you are operating in is going to work for you.
Right.
Say that again, Joe, because I don't think Scotty heard your point there.
Like faith seems to be the important word that maybe he's missing. Like you can use all kinds of techniques in your communication with God, so to speak. And you mentioned prayer as maybe just a mode. And I don't look at a prayer as just a mode. To me, it's a genuine path of communicating with God. And a lot of people don't see it that way. They don't believe in God at all. They say, there's nothing out there. And I just disagree with that because there is. When I just look at look at your pet, whether it be a dog or a cat, and you think how simple it is, but yet how complex it is. I mean, man knows nothing about the mind. He studies it in psychiatry, and he knows nothing about mental illness, even though he claims he does. Okay, and I feel my impression is that you're not going deep enough. Man has a soul, and that's why I kind of cling on to the Old Testament too. Now you talk about the New Testament. You got to go back to the Old Testament where it gets its foundation going. to help people understand what's going on in the New Testament. And I think there was a lot of foul play. I mean, the church interfered with a lot of the preachings from the Bible itself and twisted a lot of things around. But the meat of the matter is there if you take your time out and read it. I mean, it takes time, and it's like anything else. You have to go to the right church. But I see your point,
Well, those are all great. Yeah, those are great points, Joe. Thank you so much for calling in. We're just overdue for a break here. We're talking with Scotty Roberts tonight. We are kind of calling an audible here because our originally scheduled guest, Jessica Adams, couldn't be on the program. We're still researching that, and we will get her rescheduled. So Scotty has graciously accepted a 1-minute warning invitation to join us tonight, and we'll continue our conversation with him in just a moment. When you listen to this program, you hear many interesting guests who discuss many interesting topics. Most of those guests have books, movies, or other work that support their ideas, and we've made it very easy for you to find that work. Just go to amazon.com/shop/JVJ-Taps. Not only will you find the books and other work of our guests, but you'll help support this program at the same time. Again, it's amazon.com/shop/JVJ-Taps. You'll also see links in the description of this episode that you can click on. We can only scratch the surface of many of these topics, and the real knowledge is what you'll find in the pages or frames of our guests' efforts. So click the link and browse, and hey, thanks for listening. Scotty, I want to go back to this discussion about Nostradamus, and we'll return to some of this biblical stuff as well. But we were talking about Nostradamus prior to Joe's phone call. And you mentioned that there is a way to interpret Nostradamus's predictions that you can apply to many, many different time frames. People had said that Nostradamus was talking about Hitler, that he was talking about Napoleon, that he was talking about Saddam Hussein. That is kind of the problem here. But there are people that say, no, if you do that, you're just misinterpreting the quatrains or the predictions, and therefore you're not really a Nostradamus scholar and you don't understand what you're reading. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know enough about Nostradamus to speak to that intelligently, other than things I've heard. I don't know why. It's one of those topics that I just never delved too deeply into. Although I've seen a few things that say that there are overlaps, that there are things that looks like that maybe might be something that matches, and then things that are far too coincidental, as we mentioned earlier. And his work, I think, was, I don't want to say it was pseudo-prophetic. That's not the word I'm looking for. It was maybe semi-prophetic. He was starting to, he got some gleanings into
or
things.
Quasi? Maybe it's quasi-prophetic? Quasi-prophetic? That's
quasi-prophetic. You and I know people who can predict things,
right?
That we've seen them predict things, and so we know that actually exists out there. The thing about Nostradamus is his background. He was an occultist. An occultist isn't a dirty word. It doesn't mean satanic like some people think. It just means the hidden mysteries, the things that people don't know things about.
Right.
And he was into Hermeticism and occultism. And he was somebody who he started in medicine and moved away from medicine. And he went into the occult to uncover things that were mysteries to him. There's even evidence that suggests he remained a Catholic his whole life, and that he was deeply opposed to the Reformation, things like that.
Right.
I know this about factoids of his life, but he began to write all this stuff in this project. He had this project of writing of a book of about mainly there were about 1,000 French quatrains that he wrote, if I've got the number right on that. And these were undated prophecies for which he's famous today. And he didn't date them. He just said this and this and this and this and this. And that's where he left it. He gave no explanation. And so when you see things like, he used the word hister, and that's what people have interpreted as Hitler. because the surrounding elements in the quatrain
Right.
Seem to fit Hitler. And that's right there. I've just tapped the extent of my knowledge on Nostradamus.
It was pretty impressive. But tell me if you remember this any differently. Nostradamus seemed to be a rather unrecognized figure and rather unimportant for a very long time until, if I remember correctly, and maybe this was just a revival, but at some point during the 80s, there was a documentary about Nostradamus. And at that point, it kind of brought this whole topic back to the public consciousness, and it's been very popular ever since.
Yeah, that's really where you saw the resurgence, the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
You saw a lot of stuff. You saw shows like Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of.
Right.
Did big things on them. They were in those kind of mysterious shows that everybody started to draw everybody in. And that's where it really gained momentum. And that's really about the time I first started hearing about it, too.
I have. I'm going to throw a question at you here, and hopefully it doesn't catch you off guard. Are you familiar with the Tajos Cave system?
No.
Okay. We had a guest on the other night, Alex Chionetti, who has done a lot of research on the Tajos Cave system in Ecuador. And Eric von Daniken actually wrote extensively about this cave system. And the fact that this cave system has some significantly valuable treasures, including a metal library room and some other, very coveted items.
I have heard of that.
Yeah, and I just wondered if because I know that you've studied Van Daniken's work and extensively, and I think you actually had him as a guest at one of your events, if I'm not mistaken.
I did.
Yeah, I thought so. And I just wondered if you had any insight as to the cave system. We had Alex was a great guest. He is Hispanic culturally, and therefore he has a bit of an accent, so it was a bit difficult to understand some of the things that he was telling us. And I just wonder if you had any insight as to what that was all about.
I really don't. I wish I did, now that you mention it, and I have scant, vague memories of having heard about some of these things, but never really looking into them. It's like I was called and asked if I could be an expert to speak about the Bermuda Triangle, and I said, well, no. I know
really
about the Bermuda Triangle, but I couldn't dig into it deeply, and stuff like that. And I do the same thing with Nostradamus. So I've focused my attentions in other areas. So I hate to be a killjoy on
it's
that
okay.
one,
I was just curious. I thought with the Van Daniken connection, you might have a little more information about that, because I had none. I wasn't even aware this cave system existed, frankly, before we had Alex on. Let's go back to the discussion about the Bible, and I want some straight answers from you here, Scotty, because you've dismantled a lot of what a lot of people believe, and I know that you said that's not your intention, certainly. But
right.
From where you stand today, based on what you've learned and the path that you've traveled from going from, as you said, a born-again Christian in your early teens to where you are now, do you believe in God? Do you believe there is a God as the Christian Bible tells us there is?
I believe that God exists. I don't know what form anymore. It's become a little more confusing to me. I know there is scripture that we used to quote when I was back in my seminary days. God is not the author of confusion, but of a sound mind. So I would think, okay, if I'm having a lot of confusion on these issues over the years about God and who God is, maybe it's just me. And maybe I need to get a little more grounded. And so I kept researching. I kept studying. One thing I found in the writing of some of my books, I remember sitting in my chair one night in the middle of the night as I was writing something about God. And I kind of spun slowly, looking at the dead ceiling fan on the ceiling and thinking, these are the things that drive men mad, because we contemplate and we try to make all the square pegs fit into all the round holes. And sometimes you can't get it to happen. And I remember speaking to an old pastor friend of mine, and I was really spilling my guts, saying, I'm really a little lost in this stuff. I don't know if I've hit on something. I said, either God is much bigger than we ever comprehended that he is, or perhaps God is much smaller than we think he is. And I said, maybe he didn't exist the way we think he does at all. Maybe he is more. I started adopting this approach that was like, I said, I've become a practical deist. Most of like our founding fathers were deists. They were the ones that believed that, God kind of put everything in motion, wound up the clock, and then set the clock on the shelf and walked off. And, for no better way to explain it quickly. And so I started thinking, is God intricately involved? Maybe he does exist. Why does the God, I would ask myself questions, why does the God of the Old Testament seem so inconsistent with the message of the God of the New Testament? And, of course, we had explanations for that. Dispensationalism, covenants with God. Dispensations would be like, or these different covenants with man. It's like God had a covenant with Adam. Then along came Abraham. There was the Abrahamic covenant, which changed things. Then there was the Davidic covenant. Then there was, eventually worked its way up to the New Testament covenant. And that's the covenant that ushered in a whole new age when it comes to the spirituality and the way God deals with mankind. And kind of the way I saw it written once many, many years ago. They said, God, if you will, and, far be it from me, this author said, to psychoanalyze God. He said, but if you take a look at God, he says, maybe God is like a parent who is learning how to deal with his creation. And he said, because he started out this way, very firm, and it's this, and it's the law, and it's all of these things. But those things gradually, each time there was a new covenant, a new dispensation, it's like it was we called it stair-step dispensationalism when I was in seminary. It means the next step you take up, you get a little further away from the source, up and over, up and over, up and over, up the stairway. And what it was the way this author put it, was maybe God is learning how to deal with the creation. Because according to Scripture, when he created mankind, he created something that he had never, ever created before. Even as the all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful God, he created a creation that could tell him no, because he imbued them with free will. And so it was like, now this is the way I've heard this explained. Is God like a person in the sense that, if we're created in his image, what's the image? Is the image something where God has to learn, like humans, how to deal with his children, so to speak? But then again, you get in the New Testament, you find that God is still that God that says, I could wipe any of you out at any moment's notice, and it's not your business because you are mine. I own you. You're my creation. You're my things that I created. So I can do away with you and talk it all out of existence in a breath. And you have no power to stop me or to hold my hand. And so this was this picture. I mean, even as late as the 1700s, they were listening to like sermons of John Wycliffe, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And this was his big thing. It was a fear-based respect for God, rather than the love of God. I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but when I was talking just the last 2 nights on my own show, I was talking about the persecutions of the Gnostics, how the Roman Church tried to absolutely obliterate, and basically they succeeded, Gnostic mysticism. And all the things that they went through to accomplish this end. There were black-robed monks that would wander the countryside, and they would go to Gnostic shrines, and Gnostic Christians. They would go to those shrines, and they would bludgeon and beat these people. They would kill them. They would burn them. This is pre-Inquisition stuff. And they would do this to eradicate a branch of Christianity. And there was one of these bishops from within the Gnostic mysteries that wrote, I don't know which I think he wrote Constantine, who was the emperor of Rome and also the first pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And he wrote him and he said, "Why are you doing this to us? Can we not all achieve the same end of knowing God? Isn't the goal to know God, to understand God, to love God, to have love in our lives? And yet you are systematically out killing people who don't believe the way you believe." And this was not just isolated incidents. This was so widespread, they wiped out Gnosticism. And the only way we even know of it anymore is, again, the discoveries in the 40s of the writings that had been squirreled away. And so you start looking at this. I look at tonight, I talked about Hypatia of Alexandria. She was this wonderful, remarkable woman. In the late 300s, she taught at the Library of Alexandria and the school there, and Theos was her father, one of the big mathematicians. And she was a mathematician, a philosopher. She was all of these things, and yet Cyril, the Archbishop of Alexandria, where she lived, was thoroughly against her because she was pagan. She was not a Christian. And she promoted thinking and free thinking, but was pagan. And so what happens, they eventually, mobs of Christians stopped her chariot in the street, pulled her from her chariot, flayed her alive, broke every bone in her body, and then took the quivering mess that was left and burned it, and burned her at the stake. And they did this to what? Promote the love of God? No, it was to eliminate the opposition to what they were trying to do, and they won the battle. And so, you start looking at this and you say, yes, there were atrocities. There's atrocities everywhere. I look at the Westboro Baptist Church in Texas, and I say, that's an atrocity right there. That's a blight on Christianity. But is that what Jesus taught? And so you can go back and start finding the original Jesus, the historical Jesus, inside the mysteries, inside the Roman Catholic literalist history. And you can say, I believe Jesus existed. I believe he did a lot of the things they said he did, but I also believe that he was someone who was linked deeply into the Gnostic mysteries. As a matter of fact, you take one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Judas, which is one of those that was cast out of the accepted Gospels under the councils. And the Gospel of Judas paints a very different story of Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. It says in this book that Judas was the closest friend to Jesus, and that Jesus took him aside and said, you are the one who gets it. You understand the mysteries, he told them. And because you do, I'm going to ask something very difficult of you. I need you to go through the motions of betraying me. And Judas resisted this, and yet he still followed through. And there was a purpose behind it, in other words. And so all of this stuff starts to add up to a picture of things that were a little different than what we were taught they were. And how many of these old patriarchs of the faith were created for the purpose of expressly establishing the hierarchy in the church. And so there you go. I drifted way off of Nostradamus. But
it's okay. No, this is all great stuff. I did want to point out something, though. You made a reference to Alex P. Keaton earlier in the program. I'm not sure anybody remembers who Alex P. Keaton was.
Oh, yeah. I sometimes forget the name of the show.
It was Family Ties.
Family Ties, right.
Yeah.
Michael J. Fox. TV series.
Not only Michael J. Fox, but Courtney Cox made her debut there. She was first on a music video, Bruce Springsteen's "Dancing in the Dark," I believe, and then she was cast as Alex P. Keaton's girlfriend on the television show Family Ties. Yeah, so that's pretty cool too. So as you spin, talk about this stuff and kind of create a web of what's really more confusing than anything else, and I think that's the nature of this. It's just confusing. Is it possible that the spiritual part of God and Jesus and these spiritual ideas exist as they are, and yet the Word of God, which is the Bible, but it may be the Word of God, but it's also the Word of God through the hands of man, could be flawed in its delivery?
I think so. I think that there were many things that were... it takes faith to believe that God maintained the integrity of his spoken word or his inspired word. But what breaks down that faith is when you start looking through it all and saying it's not just a thing of accepting whether or not it's true, and whether or not I want to believe or choose to believe it. It's a thing of digging through everything. You start looking at the history and find it's different than what I was taught.
Yeah, right. Let's before you continue, let's jump to our phone lines. I don't like to keep people on hold too long. This is Amy calling from North Carolina. Hey, Amy, welcome to the program.
Hey, Jimmy, how are you?
Doing great, thanks. What's on your mind?
Not too much. Just calling in to say hello.
Oh, do you have a question for Scotty?
How you doing?
No, I can't think of anything.
Oh, you just wanted to say hi? Well, we appreciate you calling in and saying hi, too. That's always fun, for sure. Were you the one that asked in our chat room about the gods that predated the Christian God? Or was that someone else?
No, that was someone else.
That was someone else. Okay. Hey, I appreciate you calling in from North Carolina, Amy, and certainly appreciate you listening and being in part of the chat room. Love having you there.
Thank you.
It's kind of fun to do this once in a while, isn't it, Scotty?
Oh, yeah, it is. I love doing this. You know, it's in a way, this is kind of like just saying, hey, let's go meet for a beer. And you sit down and you just start talking. Speaking
of meeting for a beer, you and I have been doing a somewhat semi-regular program called Booze, Brews, and Bros. We do that on occasional Friday nights. People should keep an eye out for that because we kind of take this approach. We just throw topics up, and if they stick on the wall, we start talking about them, you know? But I did want to ask you in the couple minutes we have left, there have been recent headlines, I don't know if they're necessarily headlines, but certainly news reports and stories about various things that are reported to be signs that we are entering what may be the end times. And I know that there are various periods throughout history where the same thing is said, but recently there was a red calf born in Israel. Things like that keep popping up in the news. Do you see anything that indicates to you that we might be on the precipice of what are called the end times?
Well, you know, there were things that when I was a kid in high school, in youth group, in the church, that we would look at things and we'd say, our youth pastor would be speaking to the kids and he says, you know, everything looks right. Now there's all this, and mind you, we didn't have the technology back I was in high school in the mid-'70s to the end of the 70s. And we did not have the technology. We didn't even have cell phones. I tell my kids that, and they're just like struck into silence. You can't be serious.
I know, right?
You know, did you have movies when you were a kid? But our youth pastor always used to say this thing. He says, everything looks good now, he says, but God could always reshuffle the deck, he would tell us. And that was kind of the explanation of how to get around things. Now, I look at the current world stage today. Now, there are some things that are supposed to take place in prophetic literature in the Bible that say this and this and this should happen. Now, I'm seeing things getting closer, not necessarily the exact direct fulfillment, but one of them, as Joe, the first caller, mentioned, he talked about how Israel re-entered the land. There was a prophecy that said when Israel is reestablished as a state, that it would be the last generation before the time of the second coming of Christ. Then Armageddon and all of these things, what we would call the rapture, and then the tribulation for 7 years, and then the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ after the Battle of Armageddon. All of these things were things that we looked at in the prophecies. Now, one thing that was always very clear was that Israel would be the focal point during the 7 years of tribulation and during the Battle of Armageddon, the war to end all wars, where Christ would come back on a mighty steed out of the clouds. And there was all this picturesque language about it. And you look at Israel today, it talks about in the Bible how they talk about Gog from Magog and all of these kind of poetic types of names that don't mean anything really. But they talked about all these leaders from the north and the northeast that would all ally together and converge on Israel. And that when this happened, this is when God would come back. But leading up to that, there was something that was supposed to happen. About 3.5 years into the 7-year tribulation, they were supposed to reestablish and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, they say, your purists will say, what sits on the spot where the temple is supposed to have existed? Well, the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem, where you have the Wailing Wall, which is part of Herod the Great's temple walls, that whole temple compound. And so they thought, well, you're going to have to get rid of that in order for there to be a temple built there. Now you look at things as simple as President Trump recognizing the reopening of the Israeli consulate in Jerusalem, where it's been in Tel Aviv all along, out on the coast, because Jerusalem was the old capital. And so you see something like that, and I saw that happen. I go, that's interesting, because that's a step toward things. Then you see what's going on in Israel. Look at everybody around Israel wants Israel dead and wiped off the map. The Palestinian Charter states in its charter, point blank, I've read it, I've looked at it, I've talked about it. It states that that the Palestinian Authority is for the annihilation of all Jews in Israel and worldwide. And so you start looking at that and you say, there's positioning that's already been taking place over the last, 70 years, 75 years, since the establishment of the State of Israel. So you look at that. There is something in prophetic books that say all the people, all the Jews living in Israel would be Jews who could name their tribe. There were 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I don't know what the state of current Jewry is in Israel, but most of your descendants of Judaism in Israel are European Jews. And so the big question is, are they actually the diaspora, the great spreading out of Jews back after the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in 70 A.D.? So is this who they are? Can they name their tribe? Are they truly Jews by the biblical definition of Jews, or are they Jews by politic and by religion? And so there is my own grandfather, my mom's stepfather. He married my grandmother after World War II, and my mom was a little kid. He adopted my mom. He was Hungarian Jew. So I grew up in a family of Jews. My mom and my brother, sister, and me, we were the 4 goy in a huge Jewish family. And, so I grew up with all the Yiddishisms. We used to go visit great-grandmother I'd visit her in the old home and the Jewish nursing home. She was in her 90s, and, oh, Scotty, she'd say, oh, from my lips to God's ears, oh, Meshug, come here, let me, and all of that. It was all the Jewishisms that I grew up with my family. And, but we were still the outsiders as well. But all of that to say, there's all Jewish today, Hungarian Jew. Is that the same as ancient Israelite Jew? It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know. But there's some of the little things I look at in prophecy to say, are there things happening today? Right. The political scheme is there.
Yeah.
We've wanted to call Hitler the Antichrist, Stalin the Antichrist, Bin Laden the Antichrist,
right.
Trump the Antichrist.
Right.
You hear all this, but according to the Bible, the Antichrist is going to be somebody who rises up out of Judaism and can name his family and his tribe.
Right.
Trump isn't Jewish, neither was Stalin.
Right.
So there you go.
All right. Well, Scotty, we're out of time here. Let people know where they can watch your show, listen to what you've got going on, check out your work.
Come on over to my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Mr., all spelled out, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And all my shows I do, they're all archived there. You can just start scrolling backwards and seeing this whole series I've been doing and other things. So you can find me there, and you can find me at my website, ScottAllenRoberts.com.
Perfect. And I look forward to our next gathering for booze, bros, and booze, brews, and bros. I can't even say it, but I'm looking forward to it nonetheless.
Yeah.
And I actually say it a lot better after we've had a few brews. So that does help.
Yeah, so do I. And there's some things I also stumble on after a few brews. So.
Scotty, thanks for being with us tonight. Appreciate it very much.
Jimmy, thanks for having me.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by J.V. Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.